The chase begins. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the empty streets. The city, once bustling with life, was now a ghost of its former self. In the distance, the faint hum of a hovering vehicle grew louder. A figure darted around a corner, barely escaping the grasp of those who hunted them. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the crumbling buildings, but there was no time to stop and look back. They had to keep running. The weight of the past few days pressed down on their shoulders. But there was no choice. They had learned something. Something so dangerous that even thinking about it could get them killed. And now, they were the ones being hunted. Who were they running from? What had they uncovered that made them a target? Each question led to another, but the answers were buried too deep in the shadows to see clearly. The only thing they knew for sure was that the chase had begun, and there was no turning back. The dark alleys seemed endless, but they pushed forward, one step at a time, desperate for a way out. Their breath came in short gasps, but they couldn't afford to slow down. They had to stay ahead, to stay just out of reach. But then, a shadow moved in the corner of their vision, and they knew they weren't alone. Someone was watching. Someone knew they were close, and they wouldn't stop until they caught them. The fear of being caught was always there, gnawing at the edges of their mind. But there was no time to dwell on it. The silent pursuit had begun, and they could only hope that the answers they sought were worth the danger they were in. The sounds of pursuit were growing louder. The footsteps behind them, once faint, now rang with the certainty of someone who was closing in. They didn't have much time. The knowledge they had stumbled upon, the truth that no one was supposed to know, was powerful, too powerful. And now, it was a secret that could get them killed. The information was hidden in plain sight, buried deep within a network of coded messages and encrypted files. But for the first time, they had cracked it. A secret that could topple entire empires and change the fate of entire civilizations. And now they were running to protect it. But who could they trust? The quiet streets suddenly felt much smaller, more suffocating. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. They glanced over their shoulder but saw nothing. Yet they knew. They knew someone was there, someone waiting, watching, preparing to strike. Their mind raced as they tried to piece together what they had discovered. The world had changed while they weren't looking. The power that controlled everything, the corporations, the governments, even the most powerful factions in the galaxy, was not what it seemed. It was all built on a lie. What if they weren't just running from one enemy, but many? The more they thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit, but there was no time to waste on doubts. The truth had been uncovered, and now the danger was real. There was no room for hesitation. The clock was ticking. They pushed forward, weaving through the maze of streets, trying to shake off their pursuers, but no matter how fast they ran, it felt like they were always one step behind. The city around them was no longer a place of safety. It had become a hunting ground, and they were the prey. In the distance, a door appeared, slightly ajar. It was a faint hope, a possible escape. But would it lead to freedom? Or would it be another trap? They had no choice. They had to take the risk. Every decision now carried the weight of their life, and the lives of those who might be affected by the secret they had uncovered. The door creaked open, and they slipped through. But as soon as they were inside, they realized it wasn't over yet. The silence of the room pressed down on them, and they knew, whatever was coming next, they would have to face it head-on. The door slammed shut behind them, echoing through the empty hallway. It was dark inside, and the air smelled musty, as though this place had been abandoned for years. Their breathing was heavy, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. They had narrowly escaped the pursuers, but there was no time to relax. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. Not now, not ever. The truth they had uncovered wasn't just dangerous, it was catastrophic. There was a network, vast and intricate, controlling everything. From the smallest planets to the most powerful factions, everything was connected by a web of lies. And at the center of that web was a secret that, if revealed, could bring everything crashing down. But now, they were caught in that web. There was no escaping the reach of those who controlled it. And they weren't sure who was more dangerous, the people chasing them, or the ones who had placed the trap in the first place. They reached into their pocket, pulling out a small device, an encrypted data chip. It held everything. Every detail of the conspiracy. Every piece of evidence that could bring the entire system down. But who could they trust to help? The few allies they once had were now nowhere to be found, either too scared to stand up or too deep in the conspiracy themselves. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence. Distant footsteps. They froze, their heart pounding in their chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer. There was no escape now. They had to confront the truth. They had to figure out who was behind the conspiracy before it was too late. The hallway stretched out before them, dark and uncertain. They had no idea what awaited them at the end. But the one thing they were certain of was that they couldn't keep running. It was time to face their fears, to confront the forces that had controlled their world for so long. But how? How could they take on a system so powerful, so deeply embedded in every part of society? The footsteps grew louder, now unmistakably close. There was nowhere left to hide. They had to fight or be silenced forever. In the darkness, they heard a voice, soft but steady. "You can't run forever." The words hung in the air like a weight. They had known this moment would come. It was inevitable. But now, it was no longer just about survival. It was about uncovering the truth, about making sure the world knew what had been hidden for so long. With a deep breath, they stepped into the light, ready to face whatever came next. The only thing that mattered now was the truth, and they would stop at nothing to make sure it was heard. The cold, metallic walls of the underground facility pressed in on them as they moved deeper into the heart of the conspiracy. Every footstep echoed, each sound amplified in the eerie silence that surrounded them. They had reached the nerve center, the place where the secrets were kept, hidden away from the world for years. The device they held in their hands felt heavier now, its importance weighing on them with every passing second. It contained all the evidence they needed to expose the truth, but they couldn't do it alone. They had to find someone they could trust, someone who would listen and believe in what they had uncovered. As they navigated the dimly lit corridors, their mind raced. Who could they turn to? Who could they rely on? The entire system was tainted, from the highest echelons of power to the ground-level agents hunting them. Everyone seemed to be part of the conspiracy. The walls of distrust closed in, and the weight of isolation became unbearable. Suddenly, they stopped in their tracks. A soft click echoed from the darkness ahead, followed by a faint hum of machinery coming to life. They weren't alone. A figure stepped out of the shadows, a familiar silhouette that caused their heart to skip a beat. It was someone from their past, someone they thought they could trust. But could they still? Or had this person been part of the trap all along? The figure's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "I knew you'd come here eventually." The words sent a chill down their spine. They had been expecting someone, just not this person. The web of deception was thicker than they had imagined, and now it seemed like even their closest allies had been compromised. "We don't have much time," the figure continued, stepping closer. "They're already onto you. If you don't act fast, it'll all be for nothing." They hesitated, uncertainty flooding their mind. Could they trust this person? Could they risk everything on the chance that this was a genuine offer of help, or was it another step in the conspiracy to trap them? "Why help me?" they asked, their voice shaky but determined. "You've always been part of the system. What changed?" The figure's expression softened, and for a moment, they saw a flicker of regret in their eyes. "Sometimes you don't realize you're part of the system until it's too late, but now I see it for what it truly is, and I'm not going to let it destroy us." The words were comforting, but they still didn't trust them fully. Too much was at stake. Too many lives were hanging in the balance. "You're going to need more than trust to bring this down," the figure warned. You're going to need an army. An army. They had never considered it before, but the idea made sense. If they wanted to expose the truth, they couldn't do it alone. They needed to rally those who were still free from the system's control, those who were willing to stand up and fight. But where could they find them? Who could they count on? "Where do we start?" they asked, their voice steady now, filled with resolve. The uncertainty was still there, but it was overshadowed by the growing sense of purpose. The figure smiled, though it was a sad, resigned smile. "The heart of the conspiracy is closer than you think. We have to get to the mainframe. That's where everything is controlled. If we can infiltrate it and release the truth, the entire system will crumble." It sounded impossible, but it was the only option they had left. They exchanged one last look, both knowing that there was no turning back now. The stakes had never been higher. They had to succeed. The fate of the galaxy, of humanity itself, depended on it. Without another word, they moved forward into the unknown. They didn't know what awaited them at the end of this journey, but they knew that it was a battle they couldn't afford to lose. The underground facility grew colder as they moved deeper, the oppressive silence hanging heavily in the air. Every step felt like a countdown to something inevitable. The path ahead was dangerous, the risks higher than ever before, but there was no turning back now. The truth was within reach, but so was the crushing force of the conspiracy that had controlled everything for so long. The figure from their past had led them to a hidden control room, far deeper than they had anticipated. It was almost as if the place had been designed to keep people out, keeping them from uncovering the truth. The walls, lined with complex panels and humming machinery, seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. A low buzz of electricity filled the air, heightening the sense that something massive was just on the other side of the door. Their heart raced. This was it. The mainframe, the system that controlled everything. All of it. The propaganda, the power, the control. Everything. They needed to get to it, to expose the lies, to set everything free. But in doing so, they knew they'd be setting off a chain of events that would shake the galaxy to its core. "Are you ready?" The figure's voice echoed in the stillness of the room. They nodded, a mix of fear and resolve crossing their face. "We don't have a choice." With a final glance, the figure stepped forward, his fingers quickly dancing across the control panels. The lights flickered, and the hum grew louder, reverberating through the walls. The door to the mainframe room slowly creaked open, revealing a dark, metallic expanse filled with rows upon rows of machines, each one blinking in ominous rhythm. At the center stood the core of the operation, the control center that had kept the truth buried for so long. They had found it. But as they stepped forward, something changed. A sudden, piercing alarm blared throughout the facility, and the floor beneath them seemed to vibrate. It was as if the entire structure had come alive in defense of its secrets. "We've been compromised," the figure muttered, his face darkening. "They know we're here." The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. They were coming. They had been followed. The time for subtlety was over. "Get to the core," the figure urged. "I'll hold them off." They hesitated, fear gripping their chest. But they couldn't wait any longer. They had to do this, even if it meant risking everything. The truth had to come out. "Thank you," they whispered, gripping the figure's shoulder for a brief moment before sprinting toward the control center. The hallway ahead was now a maze of flashing red lights and blaring alarms. Their heart pounded in their ears, each footstep feeling like it could be their last. They'd reached the core, the central terminal at the heart of the operation. The controls were more advanced than anything they had ever seen, a mess of screens and wires that twisted like some kind of machine spider. With trembling hands, they connected the device, the one that held all the evidence, to the main terminal. A deep, unsettling hum filled the room as the screens blinked to life, displaying streams of data too fast for them to comprehend. They typed furiously, trying to make sense of the code, trying to unlock the secrets hidden within the system. But they were running out of time. The doors to the room slammed open, and a group of armed agents stormed in, their weapons raised, eyes filled with determination. They were here to end it all. "You're too late," one of them sneered. "This facility will never fall. You're finished." But the protagonist didn't flinch. They had come too far to give up now. With one final, desperate push, they activated the release, unleashing the truth to the galaxy. The screens flickered, then went black, followed by the sound of the alarm cutting off completely. For a brief moment, the world held its breath. Then chaos erupted. The truth was out. The system was crumbling. But so were they. The agents fired. The room was plunged into darkness. The moment the screens went dark, everything seemed to slow down. The only sound that filled the room was the erratic beeping of the terminal, now failing to process the sudden surge of data that had been released. The protagonist could feel the weight of their decision settling in, knowing that what they had unleashed would forever change the course of history. But then, the blaring sirens stopped. For a second, it felt like the world had paused. The agents who had stormed into the room stood frozen in place, their weapons still raised, their eyes wide with confusion. Something had shifted. They could feel it. The control they had over this place was slipping. And then came the screams. Not from the agents, not from the protagonist, but from something else, something deeper. The alarm stopped, and the hum of the facility fell silent. The air grew thick with tension, as if the building itself were holding its breath. The first agent to speak broke the eerie silence, his voice trembling. "What's happening? What did you do?" The protagonist didn't answer right away. They didn't need to. They could see the panic growing in the agent's eyes. They had no idea what they were up against. The truth had been released, but it wasn't just data. It was the start of a new era, a tidal wave of revelations, broadcasts, and secrets too enormous to contain. The fabric of the galaxy's power structures was beginning to tear apart, and no one, not even the most powerful forces, could stop it now. Outside the facility, the chaos was already beginning. Ships from across the galaxy that had been monitoring the facility's transmissions were starting to move into action, intercepting communication lines, rallying together to deal with the fallout. What had once been hidden in the shadows was now being broadcast to every corner of the galaxy. The protagonist turned away from the terminal and faced the agents. Their hands shook, but their resolve didn't falter. "It's done," they said simply. "There's no going back now." One of the agents took a step forward, his face contorted with anger. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You've just signed your death warrant. This whole operation is bigger than you, bigger than any of us. You're not going to get away with this." But the protagonist stood tall, their eyes cold. "I don't want to get away with it. I want everyone to know the truth." The agent's expression faltered. For a brief moment, doubt crossed his face, and the protagonist saw the crack in his armor. They knew the agents were just pawns in this vast game, much like themselves. But it was too late for mercy, too late for second thoughts. With one last glance at the terminal, the protagonist turned and made their way toward the door. The agents were still frozen, their gaze on the malfunctioning system and the ripples of information spreading out through the galaxy. They didn't know what to do next. The truth had become a force of its own, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. As the protagonists stepped out of the control room, they were met with the chaos that had erupted outside. Soldiers, diplomats, and everyday citizens flooded the streets, drawn together by the same thing, the broadcasted truth. The galaxy, once controlled by a handful of elites, was now united by one singular reality. Their world had been built on lies. The protagonist walked through the streets, ignoring the shouts and confusion, and found themselves standing at the center of a gathering crowd. Faces, once filled with fear, now turned to them with hope. They had been waiting for this moment, for the truth to come to light, for someone to break the chains. But it wasn't over. The agents would be coming. The elite forces would try to regain control. The protagonist knew that the war for freedom was just beginning. They didn't know how long they had, but they knew they couldn't stop now. They had started something that could never be undone. The silence was broken by a loud, distant explosion. It was time. As they prepared for the coming storm, the protagonist looked toward the horizon. There was no turning back. Not now. The days that followed the truth's broadcast were nothing short of chaotic. Everywhere the protagonist turned, they saw the same thing. A galaxy in turmoil. A universe that had suddenly woken up from a deep, controlled slumber. People had risen from the shadows, demanding answers, questioning their leaders, their pasts, and their futures. What had once been whispered in secret was now shouted in the streets, on every channel, in every corner of the galaxy. The protagonist, though, found little comfort in the madness. They had hoped for a better world, a freer world, but the consequences of their actions were becoming clear. Revolutions were breaking out, factions were forming, and the old powers were fighting tooth and nail to maintain control. The balance had shifted, but the fight for the future was far from over. As the protagonist walked through the crowded streets of the capital, their mind raced. Every moment felt like a ticking clock. They had set things in motion, but they had no idea how long they had before everything fell apart. Every step they took brought them closer to the storm that was coming. Every face they passed was a reminder of the chaos they had unleashed. But they couldn't stop now. They couldn't take back the truth, couldn't silence the voices that had finally found their power. They had to keep moving forward. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The authorities had not been idle. They had been working behind the scenes, scrambling to contain the damage, and now they were acting with more force than ever. The protagonist knew it was only a matter of time before the agents, the elite forces, would come for them. They would stop at nothing to regain control, to suppress the truth, and to restore the old order. Yet, the protagonist wasn't afraid. They couldn't afford to be. Fear had no place in this fight, not anymore. They had seen what the truth could do, what it had already done. The galaxy was changing, and there was no stopping it now. The protagonist had given the people something they had never had before, hope, and that hope would not be easily extinguished. At the heart of the capital, the protagonist met with others who had once been enemies, those who had fought for the very power they had helped dismantle. The tables had turned, and now they were allies in this fight. Together, they would stand against the forces that had ruled the galaxy with iron fists. Together, they would fight for a future that was not bound by lies and corruption. But as they gathered in the dimly lit room, a voice from the back spoke up, breaking the silence. The battle has only just begun. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The protagonist turned to see a figure step forward, their face shadowed by the dim light. The person's voice was steady, but their eyes betrayed a deep worry. The truth has been exposed, but the enemies of freedom will not rest. The figure continued. They will come for you. They will come for all of us. We must be prepared, not just to survive, but to win. The protagonist nodded. They knew this fight would not be easy. It was only the beginning, but it was a beginning that could change everything. The people had awoken, and they would not go back to sleep. The galaxy had been shaken to its core, and nothing would ever be the same again. And so, with a deep breath, the protagonist prepared for what was to come. The revolution was on the horizon. The battle lines were being drawn, and they would be at the center of it all. They had sparked the fire, but now they had to keep it burning. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: there was no going back.